Hi, welcome to Get Used to It. I'm Sheila Kuehl, your host, as usual, and today I have one of those shows where we kind of start with a topic and figure out where we're going with it. I had a thought the other day that since the governments of France and England and now Mexico seem to have taken a bit of a left turn or a return, that it might be interesting to talk about whether we see anything like that in our near or far future in the United States, and if so, what that might mean to the gay and lesbian movement as it constitutes or reconstitutes or reinvents itself. I have three wonderful people here to talk with us today about this. Jackie Goldberg, who is a city council member in the city of Los Angeles. Welcome, Jackie.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Great to have you. Charles Stewart, who is Chief Deputy to State Senator Diane Watson and the former co-chair of the National Association of Black and White Men Together. Welcome, Charles. And our third guest, Torie Osborn, finally having moved back to Los Angeles from Washington, D.C., we're happy you're here, who, as I'm sure you know, is the author of the book Coming Home to America and the former executive director of the center here in L.A. Welcome, Torie.
Thrilled to be here.
Jackie, let's start with you, because for no reason except I guess you just got back from France, and you sort of heard the premise as I stated it to the people. What do you think?
Well, I think that European politics are so very different than American politics that it would be hard to extrapolate from what's happening there. When I was in France, everyone was talking, because I was there right after the June 1st elections, and unbeknownst to anybody, not only were the conservatives turned out of power instead of gaining seats, they were routed out of power. And I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that people were very afraid that the various subsidies, which are a part and parcel of French life at really all levels, 3 out of 5 people live in some kind of housing that has some subsidy from the government in one fashion or another, either that's how it got built or that's how they get rented or so forth. Many private corporations are in part subsidized by government funds and so forth and so on. I think that the thought of the austerity program was enough for them to say, nah, I don't think so. Not interested in austerity. And they threw out the conservative government instead of the conservative government calling the elections to pick up seats. That's why they called them, was to pick up more seats so they'd be a little stronger when they went into the austerity program.
Gives new meaning to the oops factor.
Yeah, truly.
Better not call an election until you know who's going to show up.
It's just amazing. So I think the parliamentary system makes it possible for things like that to happen, because the parliamentary system is much more responsive to the mood of people than our system, which has defined elections in specific years at specific times, only a third of the senators. You can't really change this government very quickly, very easily, and that's how it was designed by people who did not like rapid change. Mm-hmm. So we're in it with a structure that makes changes. Even if the mood of the country changes, it takes a long time to get there. You've got to be able to sustain it for a long period, as I think the Republicans may be about to find out. And it's difficult to sustain it for a long period, because we've become a country, I think, that wants instant change in whatever it is that's troubling us. And government is slower than that. And so at the next 2 years, they say, we asked you for this, you didn't give us this, off with their heads. I do think, though, that there is a trend back, maybe away from the radical right. I think Newton Company gave everybody a really good view of what that would look like, and I think that's why Clinton was reelected in part. And I think that has a lot to do with the radical right's social agenda. I think they've done better on their economic front than they've done on their social agenda, but they can't it's like holding the tiger by the tail. They can't give up the social agenda or they lose a huge block of their voters. So they hold on to this social agenda, which includes homophobia and all of the other phobias that they're scatter around with their every breath. And the problem is that whole bunches of people in America just don't buy that stuff anymore.
Does it matter, though, that in the United States, I mean, if you had to point to a place or a political party or anywhere that the left might be resting, you know, ready to re-articulate its agenda, it's much more difficult to find here than, I would guess, at least in the countries where we saw this come back. Although the Labour Party in England, nobody's going to say they're the you know, the epitome of the left wing, even at
By
this point.
comparison to anything in America, they are.
Well, that's true.
I mean, the thing that Americans don't realize until they've looked at European governments is that their centrists are our far left in the Democratic Party. That's their centrists. And then they have socialists and communists and Greens and other parties. I think the parliamentary system, because you can win a few seats and still have a role. If a party doesn't have a clear majority itself, it needs to gather other smaller parties into making a majority party so that they can pick a prime minister. Nowhere is that clearer, by the way, than in Israel, where a very tiny right-wing sect can have tremendous power. Here, if you're a tiny sect, left, right, or center, you have nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think...
Because you can't even get any seats.
That's right.
I mean,
you
it's
can't
like
get a
winner
seat,
take
or
all
if you
in
get a seat, you get one seat, and you get no chairs, you get no special committee, well, you don't get anything.
Can't even have a caucus.
Right. You don't have any access to any powerful position in a structured government like the United States. A parliamentary system where they're continuously having to fashion a majority party means that small parties get to have power even with not a majority vote. So their ideas keep in the marketplace. They're always there even if they aren't the majority sentiment.
But
Here you can just crush us and move us aside.
And what about outside the government, though? I mean, I use it as an example because from far away you say, it seemed to me, maybe there was going to be some sweeping, slow U-turn. And you're right, in America it's slower than anywhere else and is meant to be. What about outside the government? Do you see any kind of forces gathering again or
yes.
inventing themselves?
Certainly the labor movement has put organizing the unorganized on the list again, which they didn't for many years. They said it, but they weren't doing it. Now they're putting money into it. I think it's going to make a huge difference because the unorganized now look like what the demographics of America are emerging to be. They are not white blue-collar workers. They are service employees, they are multi-ethnic, they are multinational, they are black and brown, they are Asian and Pacific Island. And when you begin to organize that group as the new labor movement, and that group contains gay and lesbian people who for the first time in a very long time are feeling safe enough in some places to come out, well, I think we got to, if the lesbian and gay and bisexual movement is able to reach out to the labor movement and reach out to all of those groups who fight 209, who fight 187, and mean it, not lip service, but mean it, to be out in the demonstrations, to be out on the picket lines. If we can do that, we and the labor movement and the sentiment that exists in America that we just saw in the Living Wage Coalition fight, amazing thing about that. The LA Times came out against it strongly in an editorial. The Daily News strongly in an editorial. KNX Radio strongly in an editorial. The Chamber of Commerce said life as we know it would end if we passed this thing. It not only passed unanimously, but the polls showed that like 85% of the people who vote, which is a more conservative group than just the people who live in law, 85% of the municipal voters thought it was a great idea. Now, it's because everybody who thinks for longer than 20 seconds believes that the gap between rich and poor widening is not safe for anybody.
Well, it used to be that we thought in the middle class or the lower middle class or the working class, I can be upwardly mobile. And now I think people are afraid that wherever they are, they're going to be involuntarily downwardly mobile.
That's happening.
And that's the class that you want to protect, is the one you think you're going to either slide up into or slide down into.
Right.
What do you think about all this, Charles?
Well, I think that that we're going to have to make some stretches if we're going to actually connect potential constituencies and make them real constituencies, and make sure that lesbian gays are involved in that, and take our proper role in trying to be part of a progressive movement that empowers people that haven't traditionally been empowered. And I think it's going to be real hard for the next few years for us to do that. I think that the signals from Europe are mixed. I think that it's always difficult to translate the peculiarities of another country to the situation here in America. I don't know whether or not it's that they're so unique or that we're so unique, but it's very difficult to do that. In France, you have a situation where you have the conservatives who are traditionally perceived in France as isolationist, actually being thrown out of office by Labor, which is traditionally considered an international kind of a movement, in order to protect and assure that the French people will hold on to benefits that they feel have been hard won. At the same time, what we're seeing is a movement toward coalition in Europe. But the problem is for the French is that the capital isn't in France, it is in Paris. And so I don't know how much we can translate from that to the American situation. What I do think is translatable are the economic trends. I think that what we're seeing in the United States, to some extent in England, is the fact that we're in an era perceived as very affluent. We're in a boom era, and that bodes well for certain types of movement, and it bodes well for certain kinds of strategies. And I think that we need to be conscious of that. We need to organize with that in mind. I think that we can expect that people are going to not be organizing and not fighting and not motivated out of a sense of despair. There are a lot of us who live in despair, and there are many of us who have a reason to fear, but that isn't going to move America right now. Too many of us are feeling too well, and don't bring us no bad news. However, there is a different kind of a responsiveness, and we know this historically in America during good times. People are more generous. They're more willing to extend their borders. They're more willing to extend a helping hand and an understanding hand when they themselves don't feel economically threatened. That's something that we need to be conscious of. We need to integrate into our agenda, and we can utilize that as a step-off point to organize in order to say we want part of, we want to be included in, we want to contribute to affluent America, to successful America.
Of course, you know, movements in this country based on difference, which is what we've seen probably since the advent, at least, of the civil rights movement. And again, I'm always stuck in my own lifetime, so this may be not absolutely accurate historically, but the movements based on difference have been essentially progressive. That is, they've been about liberation, they've been about equality, and you could tell me whether you think that's a progressive notion or not. I guess Americans did when they had the revolution. Has our movement really been like that? I mean, has it seemed to you to have elements of progressiveness, progressivity, whatever, in it, or is it a different kind of thing?
Absolutely. I think that we've been a progressive movement in the sense that we have started from disempowerment, from a sense of oppression, and from the reality of oppression. That wasn't something that was in our own minds. That this is something that people of color, that lesbians and gays, that poor people, that people of a variety of different groups, recent immigrants, have had to face in this country. And as we've coalesced, as we've decided that we're not going to take it anymore, we have stepped forward. We've done that through the process of identity politics. And for us, that's been more than a strategy. It's been where we are. It's been where we've lived. We've had to claim the right to be ourselves. And in doing that, I think that we have stepped into and incorporated a progressive movement. The reason it's been progressive is because we've been willing to coalesce. We've been willing to extend a sense of shared purpose and shared liberation with regard to other groups. And that's very important, and that's of the essence of progressivism. And that's, I think, something that we certainly see in the lesbian and gay movement. That's something that we see in the civil rights movement. I think that there are a lot of issues that the African American community, for instance, has with the lesbian and gay movement, because in some ways there's a perceived difference of directions needed to be pursued. Yet at the same time, you will find that black preachers, many of whom are in Congress, have been the strongest supporters of lesbian and gay rights at the congressional level, at the state level, at political levels, at all kinds of levels. That's the kind of coalition building that I think is the essence of progressivity.
Torie?
Well, Well, I think the spirit of gay liberation was certainly progressive. It grew out of the women's movement. It was linked to the various movements of the 60s. It shared a sense of connections across and between various struggles for freedom, international as well as national. And I think the best spirit or soul of gay politics over the last 30 years have been progressive, as Charles said. But I also think that inevitably the trickle-down theory of a very conservative era has increasingly had its stamp on gay and lesbian politics. And I actually think we're in a time where, from where I sit, the conservative or moderate or even, I mean, I wouldn't call it right wing. I mean, the right wing of the gay movement is like Andrew Sullivan, who's for marriage and gays in the military. I mean, that's, you know, that's not very to the right.
If we were really right wing, we'd want to beat ourselves up in the parking lot.
Right, exactly. You know, everything is relative here, but I do see an increasing power of corporations in the gay and lesbian community to basically sort of buy organizations. And I see very little discussion and debate about what that means. I do see a lack of vibrancy on what I would call kind of the left, although the term itself doesn't have a whole lot of meaning, which I think shows how kind of bankrupt ideology on the left is. And I don't want to kind of sound too academic or abstract, but I do think that we are still in a right-wing era. I do think that the right wing hasn't crested. I think that it is still the most powerful political and social force out there. And so what that inevitably means is that people's horizons are limited. The debate, the political debate, whether it's in Congress or whether it's sort of on the streets, has narrowed, in my view. I mean, you know, there's several things here. I don't think progressive forces, I think because of identity politics, which is absolutely necessary. I mean, I don't want to be in a world, I don't want to be in a new progressive era where recognition of difference, where gay and lesbian voices, where recognition of the power of feminism and women and all different and multicultural voices are not front and center. It's not a movement I want to be part of. However, I think, as many people have pointed out, the fragmentation, the loss of traditional left ideas, the dissolution of socialism as having any kind of relevance in this country, and the lack of something to take its place, have meant that there's that voices other than rah-rah capitalism, individualism, make your own way, and very conservative voices, since the right wing is so powerful, and even reactionary voices, you know, are few and far between. And I think we're in one of those in-between periods where kind of the old answers are dead. The right wing doesn't really have the answers that can unite this country, that can lead us forward. They just plain don't. They're anti-democratic, they're anti-pluralistic, they're anti the best of American spirit. But we're in a time when there isn't much on the left. And so to me, what that means is I think it calls for some interesting conversations to take place across movements. And within the gay and lesbian community, I mean, as Jackie said, I think part of the question is, when is the gay and lesbian community going to move beyond itself and really link up in a meaningful way, not a rhetorical way. I mean, you know, it's not sort of like, do you believe in NAFTA or not? You know, this sort of abstract debate that sometimes has happened in the left wing of the gay movement that's sort of irrelevant. But real questions about how do we take this vibrant workplace organizing, for example. There are so many things happening in the gay and lesbian community in workplaces, in corporations, in small businesses, in government workplaces. These employees groups are flowering all over the place. What does that mean in the context of a resurgence in the labor movement, of a labor movement that's looking to organize in sectors that it frankly ignored at its own peril over the last 30 years? How do those conversations happen across class, across race, and so forth? So I think the challenge is, for the left in general, whatever the heck that is, for progressive forces in general, and for the gay and lesbian communities, how do we move beyond our own issue? How do we have meaningful coalitions, you know, that really mean something? And how do we forge a vision, which the right wing will never be able to do, that speaks to the best, that speaks out beyond our own self-interest, that engages people in activism and in changing the world, the way we saw in the 60s and 70s.
Well, I wonder whether, let me try out one sort of tenet on you. In many ways, it feels to me as though in the last half of this century, some of what we've incorporated in government about how we want to protect people, what they consider their rights, came out of a socialistic notion that if you're going to collect all those taxes, you ought to probably use them back in a way, that tries to equalize. And it's interesting in a time when we see wealth and poverty being more polarized, still, people think about health care and access to health care as something we ought to be getting to them. People talk about, well, is there a retirement plan at work and all of that? Is that just a very small percentage of folks, or have we incorporated some of this in a way that makes it seem so mainstream that we don't see these as lefty ideas?
People in general?
People in general.
Yeah, I think health care as a right is something that people have, it came out of the legacy of the New Deal and the New Frontier, and so forth, and people do have a sense of that. That is a progressive notion.
Well, then, maybe that's where the left has been tucked away all these years, if you know what I mean. I mean, we were talking about how the multiplicity of parties in Europe, and that's a place where the flames are kept alive, etc. Maybe we're missing it. I mean, you know me, I think the glass is half full, so I try to see if these ideas are still alive because we've incorporated some of them. I don't know how successfully, but...
Well, actually quite successfully, and it is, I think, going to be where you talk about the return, where the return comes from. People have taken for granted that certain things like health care come with certain jobs, taken for granted that there are holidays and weekends off, and then we see the state legislature okay the end to the 8-hour day, and at first, well, it's working on it. But you know what I'm saying. But I think that what you're going to see is that most movements don't come out of the head. Most movements come out of the conditions that people find their lives in. The one place I disagree with you, though, is I don't think we're in an affluent period. I think we're in an affluent period for some people, but not for most people. In fact, just the opposite. I think most people are afraid about what's going to happen to them economically. And I think because they see that some of the things that they thought, we could never lose this. This is just the way it is now from now on, being threatened. Like, what does a health care plan mean if you can't go to a doctor?
Right.
I mean, I may have a perfectly good health plan. It says so. I have this little card. I carry it in my pocket, but no one will let me use it anywhere. And if I need to be in a hospital before the stitches have been finished, they're wheeling me to the front door. I don't consider this health care. Pardon me. People are going to react to that as it happens to more and more people. That's where the fight back will come from.
Well, maybe this is what links us to France in a way, and that is not the question of what labels you put on, left, right, or center, but the feeling of entitlement and the removal of whatever that is. Never mind the real word entitlement. When we talk about welfare reform, we'll probably get into that too. But maybe the notion, I'm sorry.
But no, your point about the language is really important, because the language has become irrelevant. It's become meaningless, sort of traditional left versus right versus center. I mean, it's become less relevant to describing what's going on. So I think you're right about that.
Maybe we ought to say what we think we're talking about. I mean, I realize I came to you with this notion and said, please, talk about it. But what if we have a notion, if we have an ideology about, and we call it left or progressive, what do we mean? What are some of the things that we mean?
Redistributing the wealth. I mean, in this country, we've seen a revolution from the top 1% of the country controlling 17% of the wealth in 1978 or whatever it was at the end of the Carter administration, 80, to controlling 40% of the wealth. We've seen a bigger, 50 million people or whatever living in poverty, an increase greater than in 50 years. There were trends until the last 20 years to decrease the gap between the richest and the poorest, to increase a safety net, and to basically expand the middle class. I mean, I'm not an economist, but you look at those statistics, and the fact is the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, and the middle class is shrinking.
And it's shrinking toward the low end, not toward the high end. And that's being done in a number of different ways. Downsizing is a very big, you know, I mean, the things that have happened is actually, if you want to look at a period in history that this most resembles, I would say it would be the 1920s. And because there's some specific things were exactly the same. Deregulation was considered the thing. Let business do whatever it wants. What's good for business is good for America. That was a very big part of that period. That's what's happening here now. The notion that capital should be allowed to essentially do what it wants with the environment, should be allowed to do what it wants with respect to labor. Those are both very in vogue in Washington, Sacramento, and Los Angeles.
Now capital's international.
Right, absolutely.
Which really changes the picture.
Oh, yes, indeed.
But so is labor.
Not yet, but it's going to be. It's beginning to happen. It's
isn't
beginning to
organized
happen. It's beginning to happen. But it will. It has to happen.
Markets are there now, and I think that increasingly people perceive themselves as if we're in a country where if corporations are telling us that if we're in a country where that is not friendly to making a profit, then we will relocate to where there is a labor pool that is more pliant, that is less demanding, that has less of a sense of its rights.
That's international capital talking.
Right.
An international labor movement would say, I don't care where you go, the rules are going to be the same.
No, I think what Charles meant,
we haven't gotten
as
there
I
yet.
heard it, was that you can hang that over the head of a local labor force because you're saying you
only
think
as long
know,
as you don't have an international labor force.
Right.
I mean, that's the goal. First to organize the unorganized here, but then to organize the unorganized everywhere. That's the only thing that'll fight that kind of international capital. You have to have an international labor movement.
But practically speaking, what you're talking about is organizing the West, because there are a lot of countries where you aren't going to be able to do that.
Why?
The majority of the countries.
Why?
Because, quite simply, because their political regimes aren't going to let you in to do that kind of organizing.
Well, I don't think they're going to be invited in. It's going to happen inside the country.
But we're not there yet, Jack.
Well, no, I appreciate that. That's why I'm saying. You're right.
So, but that's one of
But
the...
it's going to happen, and you can see it by looking at the countries that they're now moving out of some Asian countries, which used to be the cheap labor, who, once they started realizing how much money the bosses were making, began to organize, into the next market of cheap labor where they're still at, but eventually they run out of countries. That's all I'm saying.
But let's return to the notion of what might be elements that we're talking about, that we might include in the notion of progressive or...
For me, it's increasingly about multiculturalism and about indeed reaching out, appreciating other cultures, and recognizing that just as the global economy has shrunk, so has labor, the ability of labor to move around, to take power, to educate itself, and to reach out, embrace people who are like us and who are unlike us, and to create a kind of world, a kind of a culture which is affirming to people who are different, not necessarily becoming stuck in our differences. And because identity politics has had its uses and perhaps has had its day. But getting to a point where we understand that because someone is different doesn't mean that they can't contribute. In fact, America has always taken in and absorbed and benefited from many of those differences, but we haven't been willing to treat the people that bring those values and those ideas here. We haven't been willing to treat them as peers until they acculturate, until they assimilate. I think that we have to redefine what we mean by progressivism. Look at it. We say progressive. We don't even say liberal anymore. It's a dirty word.
Oh no, I think liberal is to the right of progressive.
Right.
That's the only reason I don't use it.
Now, it's time for a break, so I'm going to just pitch the break, and we'll be back in a few minutes. Don't go away, because we're going to continue and wrap up, and who knows what we'll talk about. We'll be right back.
Life's problems can be tough. Sometimes it helps to talk. Call us. We're Women Helping Women.
Hi, welcome back to Get Used to It. I'm Sheila Kuehl, and today we're talking about the resurgence of the left, if there is any and if there will be one, its relationship to the gay and lesbian community, if there is any and if there will be one, and anything else we think to talk about. My guest today, as I told you before, but I'll tell you again, Jackie Goldberg, City Council member in the City of LA, Charles Stewart, Chief Deputy to State Senator Diane Watson, and former co-chair of the National Association of Black and White Men Together, and Torie Osborn, the author of Coming Home to America and former ED of the center here in LA. Welcome back. Well, we've been talking a lot about economics, we've been talking about politics, etc. We talked a little about queer, but I'd like us to see if we can bring these notions, if we can, together. Do we have a movement? Do you see anything different happening in the movement? And if so, is it a thing that might help America take this turn, or are we captive to our own right wing? Tell me what you think. Anybody? Jackie.
Well, I don't think that we are exactly a movement. I think we have issues, and the issues are getting played out, some in legal forums, some in congressional forums, some on the street, but it's not really an organized movement. I think to the extent that we haven't done that is to have missed some opportunities. But if you look at the voting trends by lesbians and gay men, we're definitely more progressive, more liberal, more left, pick a phrase, than we are conservative. And that's not just Democrat versus Republican, although a gay Republican in this particular environment I don't understand anymore. I did 20 years ago, but I don't now. But it's also in terms of things like reproductive rights, you know, much better voting record in terms of progressive issues on that than the average person of the same socioeconomic background. Much better record on environmental issues than, again, a similar group of demographics that weren't also gay or lesbian. In terms of 209 and 187 in California, or the recent mayor's race, we were definitely more liberal. Not as good as I'd hope we'd be on 187 and 209, but better than the same group of people who were not gay who had the same demographics. So we are definitely, as a not well organized, but nonetheless a community of interest, because the outer world creates that for us, anti-Semite and Jew, homophobic and gay or lesbian person. I mean, if there's no homophobia, it'll be interesting to see what our identity becomes. It may really be challenged.
Well, that's this question about dualism. I mean, Torie, you were telling me about the recent version of The Advocate that you read that was all about youth. I haven't seen it.
Well, it was their issue, their double issue on under 30, and it was, what really struck me was how multicultural it was, how the sort of the new vision and what the youth in our community are talking about, sort of the leadership and the successful under 30s, is beyond gay and lesbian. It's beyond bisexual. It's beyond categories. It's sort of, I'm queer. It's much more, it's a different view of the world on this issue. And again, if you look at the polls of straight kids under 30, there is much more acceptance of gay and lesbian. I mean, it's a different world. The under 30 polling is, 30 points ahead of the over 50. It's just a different world. This issue ceases to have a great deal of meaning. Bisexuality is much more accepted. Fluidity of sexual identity is much more. I mean, it's a different world under 30. But
I do talking
do
about different racial categories or not.
Absolutely, the same thing. A sort of multiracial, multicultural.
Well, and the government, the federal government's really terrified of this.
I know, they said no.
It would not allow the census to include
all of the above.
Mixed racial categories.
That's right, Jackie, and I for one, firmly opposed it.
You did?
I absolutely
say why.
did.
What does a kid do like my son?
Who's
black and white? What's he do? What's he mark?
As far as I'm concerned, he needs to make a decision as to where his interests lie and vote his interests. In fact, the same politic we've been advocating all along here. I asked at the recent Black and White Men Together convention, how many people in this room, and I was in the Black caucus, consider yourselves black in terms of your political identity and interests? And everyone in the room raised their hands. I said, how many of you are pure black and are not at all multicultural? And nobody raised their hands. I said, we just went from a room full of African Americans to a room empty of African Americans, and we can't afford an empty room at this point.
I think that's maybe your age group, because my son's under 30, and he resents having to choose. He says, which part of me do I deny?
Except when you know that that thereby hangs a tale. There's a kind of a different thing. For instance, we can identify groups that have been oppressed are also groups that are deepest in poverty. If they're deep in poverty, then they need some help. And we need to identify, when you talk about Prop 209, which incidentally, for those of you not living in California, was the anti-affirmative action initiative that passed. This was the sort of devil's version of the non-racial definitive society.
Oh, he's not saying don't. He would not argue that you should leave out African American as a choice. He's saying if he chooses to identify himself as African American and Jewish American, which is how he sees himself, there should be a category that says mixed that he can put down if that's how he sees himself. Who is a government to tell him who he is?
And we absolutely have to affirm that. We have to affirm
that's
people
all he's saying.
Claiming all of who they are.
That's all he's saying. He's saying they're asking me to pick one and pretend I'm not the other, and I don't want to do that.
That's what Generation Q
don't
is
put me
claiming.
in that box.
I think that's a
he said don't put me in,
thing.
and every application for college he filled out, they had all these categories. He checked 2 boxes, even though every time it said only check 1. He said, I'm not going to check 1.
And this is a good thing.
That's all
I'm saying. I think
saying.
this is a trend that speaks to some of the success that the gay and lesbian community has had
Absolutely.
in putting beyond either or, in
Right.
transgendering
Right.
things,
Right.
in moving beyond dualism,
Right.
in saying to the world, you can't put us into boxes, and that's part of, in fact, what our message is. That's one of our values. It's not just about respecting and sort of delighting in diversity, but it's about moving beyond those boxes. And I think, Charles said it, we've sort of said it here, I think there's a way in which identity politics has had its day, as you put it, which doesn't mean it mustn't be in part of the foundation of some future work, but that there has to be a way that we start looking at what we all have in common. There has to be a way in which we start revitalizing a sense of responsibility to each other and building communities and politics and a national ethic of social responsibility again. And I look around me, I don't think we have necessarily a coherent movement with a strategy and so forth, but I do think if I look around and I say kind of what's bubbling and burbling and happening at the grassroots level, I think the labor movement is one, and I think the gay and lesbian movement, ironically, in a very conservative era and after multiple generations of itself. I mean, there are not a lot of movements that move along at a pretty perky pace for 30 years, and I think we're still moving, albeit it isn't necessarily organized, and it isn't necessarily kind of focused or with a clear vision. But I do think that you cannot deny that if you look in schools, if you look in workplaces, if you look in religious institutions, that the issue of homophobia is in good faith being grappled with in all of the institutions of America right now. And that makes us vibrant, it makes us necessary as we kind of identify. To me, it's a search for vision. To me, it's what is the language, what is the vision that's going to unite America across difference. I mean, there are going to be a few, really wealthy people who are into their self-interest, but my experience is that, upper middle class people who have bought in and succeeded and are prosperous, also, there's a part of them that wants to be part of something larger than themselves. And I'm not just talking about spiritual or religious. I'm talking about feeling a sense of connectedness to a sense of social purpose. Everybody has that.
Everybody wants that. Everybody wants
but
that.
It's not just the conditions. It's not sort of the vanguard of the,
No, it's a universal feeling out there.
I agree.
I see it very much in local politics, but it's not always progressive. It doesn't have to be inherently progressive.
The right wing is manipulating.
It depends on the leadership, and also, as vibrant as the lesbian and gay movement is, and I agree with your assessment, it's not always a progressive thing that our goal is. I mean, our goal really is for it not to matter, which is not particularly a forward-pushing agenda. It says we really want to be just allowed to be who we are, and it shouldn't matter to anybody as to our jobs, as to whether we get married. We want to be treated equally before the law. That's not a necessarily forward-moving agenda.
We push the boundaries on family, on
That's
definitions
true.
of
That's
family
true.
and relationships,
That's true.
on sexuality. In this Puritan country, we say sex is good, guys, and we're not letting that one go.
Right.
No matter what they say,
Right.
no matter what it's,
Right.
we think it's great.
But
you know?
having achieved a lot of that, I think it's appropriate for us to step back and re-examine the progressive movement and essentially do an analysis. What still is to be done? What is it that we found doesn't work for us, doesn't work for America, and then move forward. I think people of color are stepping forward and taking a look at that, and looking at our own families and saying there were parts of liberation that have worked for us, and from 60s liberation, and there are parts of it that haven't worked for us. We need to re-examine that and recontextualize that and make sure that the advantages, that we don't resort, for instance, back to sexism and oppression of women in the African American community in order to affirm the male members of our community who are deeply in trouble. And yet that is the way the debate is increasingly being framed, and it's going to continue to be framed that way unless we step forward.
I don't think the sisters are going to buy it.
None of the ones I know are.
That's right. I don't think the sisters are going to say, oh yes, guys, I'll wait around for you guys to figure this out.
Well, it's been an interesting progression, though, I think, because there was oppression, and then each group that has been oppressed has said, finally, wait a second. The first step is to say, no, I'm not bad. So I have to have pride. That's it. I'll take pride in who I am, even though it was originally defined by someone else saying, you're different. So I'll say, I'm proud of my difference, and now I'm going to make it a movement, an identity, whatever. We didn't really slice the world that way. It's the people who wanted to oppress who did. So then we're saying, in this community, I always thought it was amusing, I'm saying, I'm really proud of who I sleep with. You know, I mean, really, what, I don't know, everything else, but a culture grew up about it, and there is something different.
We needed to do that.
Now when people come out, they are able to take the kind of leadership that we've seen. I mean, I look around gay and lesbian people just in, you know, in California, and they, once they're comfortable with themselves, they have such power as leaders in other movements, in other places, in business, in wherever it is. Like all this pent-up energy that they never showed in junior high school or something. You know, they can suddenly do it, it's set free, but with the perspective of an outsider. And I wonder if there's some power in that.
I think so.
You know?
Absolutely.
Perspective of the outsider?
Yeah.
What the Advocate article on youth talked about was the Generation Q stepping into that space and saying, I don't want to refight your battles. I don't want to refight your wars. You've given me the space to feel good and to feel proud of being a lesbian or a gay person or bisexual and any and all of the combination as time shall tell. And I'm going to take that space. Now I don't want to have to be proud of what I am or what box I belong to. Now I want to look at what I can contribute. And that may not necessarily be what we of our generation thought it was going to be. They aren't necessarily saying, I'm going to go off to college. They're saying that what I want to do is not necessarily to fit into a corporate world and be successful.
Yeah, that's what I was struck by, was how many of them, like many of us 30, 40 years ago, said life is about changing the world.
Right.
That's what in different ways, they said it in different ways, but I thought, wow.
Straight kids too, though.
Yeah, no, I
Straight
believe
kids
that.
too.
I think it's a generation of this new generation.
But when they talk about changing the world, is that coming to what you were talking about in terms of the affirmation of, you know, multiculturalism, et cetera? Is that inherently progressive if they talk about it this way?
To a certain
it's
extent,
part
they
of
take
it.
it for granted.
Yeah.
To a certain extent, they take for granted that they don't have to identify their friends along racial lines or ethnic lines, or know that much about the gender identity, or what your allegiance is, or what your religious background is. The thing is, this is what I have to contribute. What do you have to contribute? What can we learn from one another? And that is how I perceive my empowerment. And they really are stepping off from where we've come. The problem, of course, for us, old guard, is that we still see battles that need to be fought.
Yeah.
We still see economic challenges that await, that have to be addressed. We still see inequities
And when
and
they
privilege.
come up against them, they will too.
can we wait? Will we be around?
No, we don't wait. We have to take them on right now.
Absolutely.
I'm just saying they're going to join with us in those battles as soon as they come up against them.
How different are they, though, from... How different are they from you guys at their age?
They're very different.
I mean, you standing on a car with a megaphone, and I don't know where the hell you guys were, you know? I mean, I've seen pictures of you all fighting those... But no, seriously, you were all fighting these things in the 50s and 60s?
But you see, I don't know. I came up into the 60s. I mean, I was a teenager in the 60s. I was too young to have been a part of the civil rights movement. I watched it on TV. It is what fired my passions. It is what made me who I was. And there was a sense, a mass movement of people who felt that the greatest thing to do with your life was to try to change the world. It might be changing your little high school in Bed-Stuy in New York. It might be, you know, starting a daycare center, the first ever. I mean, it had multiple forms. But remember, it was the movement. You could be doing women's stuff, you could be doing black power stuff, you could be doing later gay stuff, but you were all part of the movement for about 10 years, from, you know, 67 or something to the mid-70s, till the anti-war till the war in Vietnam was over. There was a huge sense that not only that millions of people were in motion trying to end the war in Vietnam and making the world truly democratic, you know, expanding the opportunities for more and more people, but there was the sense that that was the best thing to do. That was the most wonderful life, that was the most fulfilling life, that the personal fulfillment was political action. And that ranged along a spectrum. I mean, there were liberals, there were radicals, there were, you know, whatever, generally along a left spectrum. Now, it is different now. People are...
You know, I have a friend 20 years later whom I knew back in the 60s when we were teenagers during that era, who is a straight white male, who came to me and he said, those of us that were friends and that were and that felt such dedication then, he said, those of you who are still going forward with that are because you're black or because you're gay or because you're in the feminist movement. He said, I'm envious. I resent the fact that you have that to fight for. He was coming from a sincere place. Then how would you respond to him, Jackie? How do you respond?
If he still believes in that, then he still has a lot of work to do.
Well,
he has a lot of work to do. He's letting himself off the hook. I'd say get involved in organizing a fight back on behalf of the people who are about to be thrown on the street through the various federal changes.
But his point was that we were fighting through identity politics.
He was never fighting through identity politics.
No, he wasn't. We were.
Yeah.
He owned the new left, the student movement.
And that's his contention.
No, I don't agree.
Well, give us the words and the strategy then, Jackie. How do we engage him? Because that's America.
Because he was fighting for a world in which he would be able to enjoy the fruits of his labor, and so would everyone else around him. He was never fighting for white maleness.
No, I know, but I think it has been hard the last 15 years.
Only when you want to let yourself off the hook.
Only when to find a place for themselves, unless they happen to be in the labor movement or unless they happen to be in local politics.
All I'm saying is I think they're letting themselves off the hook.
Even if that's
too
true,
easily.
that's not a winning argument.
No, I understand that.
You have to feel grabbed by it.
I wasn't trying to recruit people that way.
But how do we do that?
Very simple. It's very simple. The things that we believed in as white left people in the 60s were what? Were that there's something more important than just yourself. All right? That there is a public welfare, a greater good. That we are interconnected. And that if there is any group that is not doing well, it affects me. It's not I'm doing for them.
Right.
That's bullshit then, it's bullshit now. You do it because you're connected to everybody else.
Okay, let me play the devil's advocate. Let me try to talk like a straight white male here.
Oh my God! It's right here first on Sheila's show.
This will be good.
How do these things happen to me?
Go for it.
those things were important to me then, and they were right, and I still believe in them. But you know what, Jackie? I found out life is hard. I found out that that it's tough for me to get into the kind of job that matters to me, that lends me meaning, that it's tough for me to make a family work and stay together, that it's tough for me to ensure that my kids are going to be able to make it in this society, that has absorbed an enormous amount of my energy.
You do very well.
Thank you.
And I'm telling, and I would
too.
say to you that if you are not about expanding the opportunities, it will always be tough for your kids and for you. You see, the argument that the right wing makes is that there's only so much, there's just a very little stuff that we can have, and therefore you have to knock everybody aside and hold on to it. That's not true.
I agree.
The reality is that there is enough for everybody. There really, truly is, particularly in a state like California, which is so incredibly wealthy. There is enough for everybody. It means that you have to be willing to stand up and say that those at the top just can't have unlimited amount. That's all. Not that they can't have more than anyone else, they just can't have an unlimited amount. There is enough is enough. There is enough is enough. And that there are limits to everything. And that we live in an ideological time where there is no limit. You're entitled, in fact, you're encouraged to believe that you should be able to acquire more wealth than if you spent as much money as you could spend every day of your life. You could never spend it all, and that's okay. Mm-hmm. Right. And if he believes in what he says he believes, he'll say that's not okay. That's not okay.
But maybe go ahead.
Or not enough.
There is enough
right.
for everybody to be able to send their kids to college. Why do we fight over affirmative action? Because we believe that we shouldn't be building more and more universities so that every kid who wants to go gets to go. That's when you have to fight over it. You create scarcity, and then you have to fight over it.
That's right.
Right.
That's right, because
There's
we're building
virtually no reason why
I can
there
tell
isn't
you we're
enough.
building plenty of prisons.
There's
Nobody
no
has
reason
said that we've got too many prisons.
Let's close a few of them down.
No. We need 14 more if we hadn't
Exactly.
drawn that line, in case anyone
Exactly.
wonders why the budget was late in California.
No, but that's the point, and that's where we have to make the argument. That's where leadership makes a difference. You say, there's virtually no reason in a state like California. Now, you can pick places in the country where, frankly, their natural resources are not great, where you may have to argue what the federal role ought to be. But in California, you don't need a federal role to have enough universities that every single kid who wants to go ought to be able to go, and for free.
But the attitude requires an absence of fear for one of two reasons or both. One is you don't care if you have enough, because you can live on what you've got and you raise your family to live on what you've got. And it's okay, it isn't like needing a bunch more. The second is you feel comfortable with what you've got. And it's fine. You feel, and you were talking about in the expanding economy, when people are making more, they're more generous. And you said you didn't think the economy was expanding, although the numbers show something is growing, but even more than the stock market. Unemployment is down. But
unemployment is not down. Unemployment is technically
Relative to
down because they don't count the people who have stopped looking.
mm-hmm.
Unemployment is not down.
But but you can't deny the fact, it isn't just government disinformation. More people in the last few years, for example, have felt that the recession has receded in California, that there is a sense, if you look at polling data. Now, we could have, mass false consciousness going on here, but
it depends on who you're talking to.
But there are a lot of middle-class people who feel as if, who are feeling a little more secure at, I don't know you know the numbers better than I do.
I don't know the numbers. I can tell you that.
But wait. See, the point it's not to argue, because the point is that unless we create a movement that speaks to the fellow who's in whose persona you just were, and that speaks across class lines, and that goes back to what you said, that if somebody is poor and hungry, not that person feels so other that I don't want to deal with them, but that somehow I feel that there's something I can do. Many people in this country, particularly straight white men who've been left behind by the movements of the last 15 years, don't feel a place for themselves in a vision of moving forward. I have no argument with anything of what you've said, except that I don't think that there is the leadership or the ideology or the vision or the movements moving that speak to this fellow. Because you can't, in the United States of America, build a movement without middle class participation. It cannot be a movement simply of unorganized strawberry workers. It has to be a cross-class movement. It's going to have to be to make substantial change. So we're going to have to reach this guy, whether
absolutely.
and yeah, because he owned the New Left. There's a little bit of sour grapes there, and we can all say, yeah, well, we needed our time too. Women needed our time for our voices, and gays and lesbians did, and people of color did so, buddy. But the fact is, we better figure out a way for us all to come together, or we're all in trouble.
Say to him. I was suggesting, though, that there are straight white men who have found a way to be involved and be relevant in all of this.
Yes, sure.
And I'm simply saying I was annoyed that he was letting himself too much off the hook. It's different if he never claimed to have those views.
You're not going to believe this.
We're out of time.
But we're like within 30 seconds of being out of time, and I wanted to take that 30 seconds just to, no matter where we are in the middle of a conversation, we would never have neatly wrapped up any of it. So I want to thank you, Jackie, thank you, Charles, thank you, Torie, thank you very much for being with us. I can bet you that we're going to still be sitting here the next 15 minutes finishing this conversation. I'm so sorry you can't be with us, but please do keep tuning in, because there's change in the wind and we ought to get used to it.